Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the Truth Seekers show, where we not only examine important issues ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative, but also really try to delve down to the fundamentals of thinking, our means of gaining knowledge and achieving certainty. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today, we're going to ask the question, and indeed answer the question to some extent, why is it that some people never wake up? Now, first up, I have to confess that my previous podcast was all about how we shouldn't use the metaphor of waking up. And I prefer to think of it as gaining knowledge and acquiring convictions, wising up, gaining awareness. And this previous episode was at pains to explain why the metaphor is effectively a call to inaction. However, I want to speak to all of you out there who are familiar with that metaphor. So I'm using that in the title of this episode as well. So why is it that some people just won't wake up? They just won't wise up. They won't, or they appear to be resistant, shall we say, to entertaining new and challenging ideas. They appear to be resistant to acquiring their own convictions and holding on to those convictions in the face of opposition from the people around them, from the general group or from any particular conversation that they're in with a few people, or in other words, they find it very difficult to entertain ideas that are outside of the mainstream narrative, that are generally considered to not be the case, shall we say. And there are a lot of people out there like this, as I'm sure that you know, and it appears that the facts just bounce off. They seem to be impervious to reasoned arguments, and it doesn't matter how well you explain things, it doesn't matter how much evidence you present, it all just bounces off. So this is really the question that I want to delve into today. Let's first remind ourselves, of course, that to hold convictions means to possess genuine knowledge. It doesn't mean that you're repeating hearsay. It means that you understand things from a first-hand grasping of facts and evidence. Your understanding of or your understanding of how you arrived at your conclusions. You have an understanding of how you arrive at your conclusions, and your mind is effectively respecting that hierarchy of knowledge, and all of your conclusions stand on other conclusions, which stand on further conclusions, which are ultimately rooted in reality. This is essentially what genuine knowledge is, as opposed to what's very, very popular these days, which amounts to not much more than just repeating convictions. Believing or rejecting answers without actually knowing the working out that goes behind arriving at those answers. So we're all very familiar with the fact, from our own personal experience, those of us that are thinkers who necessarily arrive at conclusions outside of the mainstream. It's what this show is all about. And we're familiar with the fact that the vast majority around us just, it seems like they'll never get it. So hence this idea that, these people just will never wake up. Why is that? So I've uncovered several reasons. I don't claim that this list is exhaustive, and feel free to comment. And indeed, we can perhaps add to that list together. But I want to share with you today what I have discovered so far. And a sort of a broad umbrella reason, you could say, is the concept of groupthink. So it's essentially following the herd and believing what is generally believed by most people out there. It's the plugging into the they say this, they say that, or indeed following the mainstream narrative in other ways, being unable to challenge the ideas that are presented to you, in my case in the UK, by the BBC, but whatever country you're in, whatever your mainstream source of propaganda stroke news, alleged news is, groupthink is this tendency to just be going along with it. And rather than arriving at conclusions independently about the world around us, about what's going on, it's the tendency to preferentially go along with the consensus. Groupthink. Very, very common. And I think there are a few reasons that underpin this phenomena of groupthink. So I'm going to go through these for you. So the first one I want to share with you is a form of subjectivism. Firstly, let me just define subjectivism, which is essentially the idea that if I think it's so, then it's real. It's the idea that I create my own reality, and it can be a group thing as well. If the groups say that it's so, then it must be so. Or it can be supernatural. There are kind of three forms of subjectivism that I've identified. One can be that the supreme being said it's so, therefore it is. Another is that the group, the sort of collective subjectivism, holds that something is true, therefore it's true. And of course there's personal individual subjectivism, which is just I feel that this is true, or I think it's true, not on the basis of any rational argument, of course, but I just that's my feeling, that's my position, and therefore it's true. So this is subjectivism. And one form of this is that people who are exhibiting this characteristic of subjectivism can't conceive that something is true or could be true if they can't understand, see, or conceive of how it could be achieved. So very typically with the idea of a global political agenda towards one world government and tyranny. Huge numbers of people out there cannot conceive of how this could happen because their knowledge base may be inadequate to grasp that. They don't have the mental coordinates to understand that picture. And as a result of not being able to understand it and conceive of how it could be possible, they will reject the idea flatly. They won't look into it. They won't consider it in any way credible simply because they can't conceive of it. And this sort of spills over into evil doings and so forth, where people can't conceive that because they wouldn't do something, because they wouldn't commit a certain atrocity, because they wouldn't commit a certain crime, because it's something that they would find unethical, abhorrently unethical, they can't conceive of the fact that it could be out there and others could be doing it. Could be lots of people doing it. So these two things are related. And this kind of subjectivism, I suggest, is one of the many causes underlying this sort of tendency to never wake up. And it does dovetail into groupthink, of course, because if you're steeped in groupthink, you will necessarily be sort of plugged into what everybody else says. Your information source will be necessarily confined. It won't be broad. You won't be examining all of the particular options and theories and suggestions, all of the avenues of inquiry. And because of your reduced knowledge base, therefore your ability to conceive of something is going to be necessarily much smaller. So that is subjectivism. That's one of these points. So the second reason underpinning groupthink is an inability to think logically, or perhaps more fundamentally, an inability to think at all. And this is essentially a lack of appreciation for the essential requirement to follow a rational argument before we file a particular conclusion away as true. It's an inability to reason logically. And after decades of woefully inadequate education in modern government schooling, over decades, we can see almost institutionally a failure in the majority of people to appreciate the basics of reasoning and deduction and inference and the requirements of evidence, proof and logic in the arrival or in arriving at conclusions in our thinking. I suggest that this is a cultural failing almost. It's so common. And this inability to think logically, to appreciate the rational argument, leaves lots of people with a sort of a blank, really, where an inability, like a fundamental disability, I should say, in their reasoning capabilities. They simply don't have the reasoning capabilities. And of course, this is going to predispose them to go along with groupthink. Necessarily, as soon as you don't have your own means to achieve knowledge, you're going to have to effectively defer to the supposed or alleged knowledge of others. So again, this inability to think logically, it has deeper roots, and you could say that it's a part of the superficial reasons underneath groupthink, but let's try and dig deeper as we go. So, as a result of this subjectivism and lack of thinking skills, we then come to the predisposition, if you like, of people to fall for logical fallacies. Now, an obvious result of a failure to follow the logical argument and a failure to grasp or a failure to appreciate and learn to distinguish between stronger and weaker logical arguments. And this is the very process of thinking. The essence of it is reasoning. It's going to leave people more predisposed, if you like, to falling for logical fallacies. If you don't know about logical fallacies, I suggest that that is an area of self-education that you might want to visit. There are a number of resources where you can do that, particularly a previous podcast interview I've done on the subject, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. But logical fallacies are ways in which unthinking people can be, or any unthinking mind can be tricked into thinking that there is a reason when in fact there isn't. And there are two important ones here that I want to mention. And the first is the delegation to authority, or you could say the appeal to authority. And delegation to authority is delegation to authority is a legitimate and sometimes very necessary thing we have to do. We have to consult experts. We have to go to people who have more knowledge than we do in a given area. But the logical fallacy of appealing to authority will, in essence, it's I'm an expert, trust me, or trusting the doctor because he's got a white coat and a stethoscope on in all matters to do with your health, just because he is an authority figure. Now, as I said, it's necessary to delegate, and I'm not a doctor. I don't have a medical training. But as thinking individuals, if we're maintaining our ability to think independently, if we are not to fall prey to the concept of groupthink and thus become one of these individuals who will never wake up, then we must take ultimate responsibility for the sources of information that we counsel when we are forming our conclusions. So the delegation to authority is very, very powerful. It's extremely powerful in the minds of any in those individuals who routinely choose not to do their own thinking, if they're group thinkers, if they're going along with the narrative, if this is something that one does as a sort of operating principle, if you like, in your way you use your consciousness, if you habitually defer to the BBC or your favourite news outlet. I hasten to add that the BBC isn't the only source of propaganda and alleged news in the UK. It's just the one I tend to use as the stereotypical, because they're so blatantly propagandist. But coming back to the point, if one is used to this groupthink, it's very, very tempting to fall into a habit of over delegation to authority. We see this, of course, when people, listen to politicians. In spite of politicians' dreadful reputation for being liars and untrustworthy, it's frankly quite bizarre how many people will still believe them in these matters of great concern to do with global health issues that we're seeing going on at the moment, and this narrative around the disease that's supposedly sweeping the earth. And the group thinker will easily delegate to the authority of a politician or a so-called expert in virology or some such. And we have to be very, very careful in doing this. And I suggest that a useful tangent here, let me just go off at a tangent, but a really essential principle for the truth seeker, for anybody wishing to know what's real and what isn't, is the principle of non-contradiction, the law of non-contradiction, you could call it. And as we know, contradictions don't exist in reality. For example, you can't be hot and cold at the same time. I can't be in London and in Edinburgh at the same time, etc. We all know and grasp, because it's obvious, that contradictions do not exist in reality. And our mind, our knowledge base, needs to be a mental map of reality, and thus it needs to correlate with reality. So when we spot contradictions in our thinking or in the narrative or in any information that's presented to us, because we know that contradictions don't exist, this should flag up for us, and we must investigate to eliminate the contradiction. So what does that mean? It means that if one person on one hand says this, and if the other person happens to say something completely contradictory, there's a problem there. Contradictions don't exist, and you need to resolve it. So if you hear of some doctors saying this and some doctors saying something else, you need to visit both of their claims effectively, and once again, that important fundamental, listen for the reasoned argument. So I'm not a doctor, as I said, but I'm very judicious in my choice of experts and authorities to which I delegate. And this takes work and effort, and it just has to be that way. There's no way around it. In order to be knowledgeable, to have firm convictions, and to be sure of what you know, you have to put this effort in. But if you listen for the reasoned arguments for and against various practices, various alleged experimental medical treatments that are being widely encouraged on the population these days, if you listen to the rational, reasoned argument that various proponents of the contradictory ideas are offering, this is where you use your ability to follow the rational argument, your intelligence, your ability to rationally think, to induce, infer, follow the argument. And this can be done, and you can quickly find which side of which argument or which particular expert is reasoning the most logically. And as another aside, you'll find that a lot of the time, particularly in the mainstream, when the mainstream ideas are being advocated, you'll notice, it becomes very conspicuous after a while, that they're just making assertions. It's very, very common for assertions to be made and for assumptions to be stood on without being questioned, and that doesn't constitute a logical or rational argument. So, as we delegate to authority, I repeat, we have to be very judicious, we have to be very careful in sourcing, in finding, I should say, credible sources. And this doesn't mean just switching on any old random source of information. The mainstream view on anything is pretty easy to get hold of. Open any newspaper, watch telly, listen to the radio, and there it is. You'll catch a flavour of the gist of the mainstream position, with some minor differences. The trick is, and this is ever so important for somebody who really wants to know the truth, the trick is to seek out, to deliberately go and find the so-called conspiracy theorists and the so-called nut jobs who are advocating something absurd. Go and find their argument and look and see what reasons do they give. Now, I found in my personal search for truth on the big global disease issue, I found that in my fastidiousness to find a logical, rational argument, I did chance upon some doctors that are doing just that. Kaufman, Cowan, amongst others. There's a whole bunch. But you can find the people that are making a reasoned argument, and you could, and you can rather, and you should evaluate that argument. And this is essentially the antidote to an over-delegation, if you will, to authority. So to sort of summarize that and wrap that up, if you like, the delegation to authority is supremely powerful in the minds of somebody who's not predisposed to independent thinking. They will generally be fairly undiscerning in the authority figures to which they will delegate to supply them with the conclusions that they should hold as true. So let us not forget, I want to stress that delegating to authority is very necessary. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it should not be done. None of us can know everything, and we all have to choose which authorities we're going to listen to, and it does take effort, and it takes homework, groundwork, and it takes canvassing this side and the other side of an argument. It takes deliberate canvassing of both sides of an argument. There's no other way to do it. There's no shortcut. The second of these logical fallacies that is appealed to when people are not in the habit of independent thinking is the appeal to emotion. And again, when we're not in the habit of doing our own reasoning, we need to know what to do, and we need to know how to live. We need to know what's true and what's false, or have some idea of what's true or what's false. And so we have to do something, and generally people will look around them, they'll look to see what everybody else is doing, they'll look to the mainstream narrative. And consequently, the group thinker, if you like, will be necessarily predisposed to having their emotions appealed to, perhaps being frightened or being encouraged to be fearful, of certain things. And as I'm sure you know, everybody's heard it from so many sources, when we're in that state of fear, or we're psychologically in a fight or flight state of affairs, we're not necessarily doing our best rational thinking, and we're grabbing at conclusions rather than sifting through them meticulously and carefully. So the appeal to emotions can very often use fear as its primary motivation, and it can also use other emotions too. But the fundamental point is that there is no replacement for rational thinking if we want to know what's true. As I've said many times on my podcast and on my website, emotions are not tools of cognition, as Ayn Rand said. They're a very necessary part of life. They're essential. I love emotions. They're great. They're part of our human experience. But the key here is that they are not a means of discerning truth from fiction. They cannot tell you anything about objective reality by their very nature. And I go into that elsewhere. I'll leave a link below to that also in the show notes. So the last point I want to mention to you, and perhaps it is the most fundamental point under this whole idea of groupthink, and it's, I think, a very credible explanation for it at a fundamental level, and that is something called social metaphysics. Now, this is a term coined by Nathaniel Branden, a philosopher and psychologist predominating in the last century. He passed away in 2014, I believe it was. But he developed this idea of social metaphysics. And let me expound a little bit on that. Firstly, I want to say that the fundamental issue is the lack of psychological independence. And when we're talking about why people won't wake up, why won't people get it, we're talking fundamentally about the ability or not to think independently, to be psychologically independent, to be intellectually sovereign with one's ideas, to have one's own collection of ideas that one can stand on and say, these are mine. I thought them through. I understand them. I hold that these things are true. And it all rests on this concept of being psychologically independent. So Nathaniel Branden came up with this concept of social metaphysics, which he meant to be taken literally. So social metaphysics, what does it mean? Well, metaphysics is the basic branch of philosophy. It's the most fundamental branch of philosophy, where it's the study of what is true, what is real, what is reality. Metaphysics asks the question, what is real? And social metaphysics, therefore, is the tendency to look towards the group or other or authority in order to know what is real. So social metaphysics is to be taken literally. And he defines it like this. Social metaphysics is the psychological syndrome, a syndrome being a collection of symptoms characterizing a specific illness. So social metaphysics is a psychological syndrome that characterizes an individual who holds the consciousnesses of other men rather than reality as his ultimate psychoepistemological frame of reference. Now, when he uses the term psychoepistemological, that's the term that he and Ayn Rand coined, and it's essentially psychoepistemology is the way we habitually use our consciousness. It's to do with epistemology, the study of knowledge, the philosophical study of knowledge, and psychology. It's a mixture of psychology and epistemology. How we characteristically use our consciousness in order to think, reason, and acquire knowledge and gather and hold our convictions. So let's delve into this concept of social metaphysics, because according to Brandon's theory, the vast majority of people are social metaphysicians, to varying degrees, of course. It's a sliding scale. All of us to some degree, very few of us are absolutely thoroughly independent thinkers, although I hasten to add that is the goal that we should all aspire to. So he bases this idea of social metaphysics on two fundamental aspects of human nature. One, man is a being of volitional consciousness. The basic choice is to use his consciousness, his rational faculty, or not. So either we think or we don't. That is our basic choice. We are essentially volitional beings. We don't have any automatic knowledge. We have to choose to think. And the second point is that man, the species, is a rational being. And the exercising of his consciousness in thought is his survival mechanism. Now, obviously, a lot of people are irrational, and that is the problem. But that doesn't mean that human beings aren't, by their very nature, fundamentally a rational animal. But we have to choose to exercise that rational faculty. That was the first point, remember. So we're volitional beings and we need to be rational. It's our survival mechanism. So according to Brandon's theory, these two facts impose a solemn responsibility on us all, which either we can face, take and accept willingly, or we can resent and evade. And a lot of people choose to evade it. And this, of course, is the problem. We have to, if we're to function properly, given those 2 points I just mentioned, we have to choose to initiate a reasoning process, and we have to constantly check our conclusions by observation and logic, by looking at reality and thinking logically. And he must choose, man must, us humans, we people, I use the term man as a species term, I hasten to add, not a gender term. Man must choose to be guided by his rational judgment. So, faced with this responsibility, there's the choice to either accept it or reject it. And the healthy individual, the fully functional, psychologically healthy, intellectually sovereign individual it stems from, or they are choosing to accept this responsibility. You can't arrive at a healthy psychological state or intellectual sovereignty without this, of course. And if we reject that responsibility, it can lead to all sorts of problems. It leads to neurosis, anxiety, depression, inferiority complex. And it's because of this responsibility that we're volitional beings and that we have to be rational. It's the escape from that can cause all sorts of problems and undermine our self-esteem. And self-esteem, as Brandon advocated, is absolutely essential for proper functioning. There are a lot of conventional thinkers out there that will disagree with this. Again, remember, we're outside the matrix in this show, and if you follow the reasoned argument and look into Brandon's work, the arguments are very, very convincing. So Brandon goes on to argue that the extent to which people default on this responsibility of a volitional consciousness, the choice to think, is the extent to which they default on proper human growth, and they effectively sabotage their intellectual and psychological growth and intellectual development. And they kind of implicitly declare themselves a second-rate citizen, a second-rate human being, I should say, in a metaphysical sense. It ultimately results in foregoing any first-hand contact with reality. It means that you necessarily have to look to others for your means of guidance. If you're not going to risk forming your own conclusions and facing reality then on your own, then necessarily we need to look to others in order to achieve that guidance, in order to know what to do. So becoming a social metaphysicist, to use that idea, obviously doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in any day, week or month. This is a result of it happens over years or decades of a continuous habit of defaulting on thinking. When a young individual is confronted with a situation where what he thinks is right, he knows what he thinks is right, but he has a feeling pulling him to do the opposite. If he develops this habit of habitually going with his feelings, this is the development and the construction, if you like, of this predisposition over a long period of time. It doesn't happen overnight. The tendency for groupthink, for these people that will never wake up, or the social metaphysician, difficult word to get out, as Nathaniel Branden said, to default to others, this tendency to follow the herd, is all the more prevalent with big issues, really important big issues, to do with scary diseases going around the globe, or what we should do in terms of values, of knowledge, whether or not we're going to believe in climate change and sacrifice our lifestyles in order to save the planet. On these big issues, there will always be a tendency, or a stronger pull, you could say, to go with the groupthink, to go with the narrative, to go with the consensus, than to even consider standing on something as risky as one's own judgment. Risky, of course, to those unfamiliar with the practice of thinking. So this kind of person, or the person exhibiting this tendency to any significant degree, subconsciously knows that this is wrong. You can't escape in any clash between your judgment and the judgment of others. If you're going with the judgment of others, you're going to feel guilty about it. It's inescapable, because you subconsciously know that it's a choice that you're making. You're evading thinking, and this is subconscious. I do stress the individual is not necessarily conscious of this. And the bottom line is it can't be escaped without guilt. But there really is no escape from reality and from our nature and our manner of survival as rational beings. And of course, we must remember that every living species that possesses awareness can survive only by the guidance of its consciousness. That is the role of consciousness for living things. And we men, the species, are guided by our particular form of consciousness, a volitional one, and one that must focus, perceive, draw abstractions, gain knowledge, pass judgments, form values, and decide what are the right goals to pursue in order to survive and achieve our well-being. This is dictated by our very nature, and this is it's not something that you can escape. It's not something that your subconscious can escape, at any rate. So if we choose as our characteristic way of using our consciousness to evade thinking, obviously we're only left with this possibility to follow others, which essentially means that you become a parasite of consciousness. The person that doesn't think, that follows the crowd, is necessarily continues to live and exist on the backs of the thinking of others. You're deferring to the thinking of others. Whether or not that's correct or not, you may follow somebody that's thinking correctly, or you may blindly follow a narrative and go over a cliff with the rest of the lemmings. But the point is that you're blindly following. So it means that you're effectively a parasite of consciousness. It's not something that's even conceivable in any other living species other than the human species, which of course has this volitional consciousness. Brandon goes on to note that the man who has abandoned his mind effectively lives in a universe of people. People, not facts, become his reality. People, not reason, are his means of survival. And it's with them that he must deal. It's with them that he has to understand or please, placate, deceive, manipulate, obey, etc., etc. The social metaphysician lives in a universe of people, and this is at the root of the tendency towards groupthink, because in that situation, of course, there is no other there is no other standard of truth or rightness or personal worth. The only way that you can feel good about yourself, as well as gaining your information about the world, is through the approval of others. So it's quite a broad condition, this social metaphysics. And I hasten to add, it's on a sliding scale. It's not an all or nothing situation. And one other thing I wanted to add about this is that this form of groupthink, this theory explaining why people simply ditch their own judgment and blindly follow the group, is that we have the sort of conformists and the non-conformists, but both can be varieties of social metaphysics. And the conformist clearly is doing his best to follow along with the group, but you also have the sort of knee-jerk non-conformist, the rebel without a cause, the people that are just against things, and in some respects they are as helplessly beholden to another group, albeit a minority group, as the mainstream conformists are to the mainstream narrative. And the solution to both, of course, is independent thinking, that psychological independence and intellectual sovereignty. So in this context, where the vast majority of people are plugged into the matrix, they are following the mainstream narrative, clinging to the mainstream narrative, we're in a situation where the emperor has no clothes on. I'm sure you've all heard of the famous story, The Emperor's New Clothes. The emperor is duped by a couple of cunning men who stitch him fabulously expensive clothes that are invisible. And of course you have to be sort of enlightened and morally superior in order to see the beauty of these clothes, and nobody wants to risk that. It's a classic story of groupthink, and ultimately in the story it takes a child to stand up and say, hey, the emperor's got no clothes on, he's naked. And we're in this situation now in our culture with mainstream news as it's presented, in that the emperor has no clothes, and there are not very many of us like that child in the story that's prepared to say, hey, the emperor's naked. But of course these days you're belittled, you're shot down, you're labelled a tinfoil hat wearing nut job conspiracy theorist if you dare to point out that the emperor has no clothes on. And that really is a measure of just how lost and how profoundly off the rails our Western culture has become. And I'm going to add further to that even many experts in their field to whom we may rightfully delegate, even those ones I've found people that I delegate to, and in their area of expertise, I can follow their rational argument and go with what they're saying. But a great many of them, I find, will be speaking on another subject and they are completely in the matrix. It's as though their tunnel vision, as they've delved into their area of expertise with this fantastic thing, the division of labour, they've gone in there and they've found out the truth in their area, but almost to the exclusion of having the time and ability to see all of the other coordinates of reality that the fully aware, clued in human being needs these days. It's as though they've sacrificed that with too much tunnel vision, and then they're sort of in the mainstream narrative with many other things that quite often they're mystics that believe in God, which I think is a fundamental undermining of any means of achieving certainty and knowing truth. So the point is that, or the takeaway point here is that most people out there are repeaters. They don't do any of their own thinking. They don't seriously question any of the conclusions that are handed to them in the mainstream narrative, or even in conversations amongst friends and family and their peers. Most people simply accept the conclusions of others as unquestionable, as facts. If a sufficient number of people are seen to agree or similarly hold that position or believe in it, then that is taken as good enough. And this is the problem. This is really groupthink in its essence, and this is why these people will never wake up. And a big takeaway point here that I hope you will get is that no one has the monopoly on truth. Absolutely no one. I certainly don't claim to get everything right, although I would say that people like me and you, if you're in this camp, to the extent that we research many different subjects, the extent to which we practice judicious and scrupulous rational thinking, find sources that we can rely on, and to the extent that we zoom out to see a bigger picture, enables us to get more key coordinates of truth in our mental map of reality than do the experts who necessarily focus in on a smaller remit. So nobody knows everything, everybody can make mistakes. This is why the thinking process and following the rational argument is essential. Everyone can make mistakes. It's the argument that really is key. We all have to delegate to authority on occasion, but we must be careful and choose who we delegate to, choose sources. And once again, I know I keep repeating it, but it's so important. Follow the rational argument. So by way of conclusion, I hope this sheds some light on why do some people not wake up. Some people will never get it. And I think the tendency for some people in the truth-seeking community to get over, to cling to false hope, is this idea that everyone is going to wake up, the idea that people will get it. And again, it comes down to this subjectivist tendency that, if I've got it, if I know how to think, surely everybody else will. But, reality doesn't work that way. People are different, and the vast majority of people don't know how to think, and I would suggest that the vast majority have no hope of so-called waking up. They have no hope of ever becoming fully informed, functional human beings, fully psychologically independent and intellectually sovereign. And a hallmark of this is you need to be able to zoom out far enough to be aware of the global political agenda that's unfolding. You have to see the bigger picture. You have to zoom out to see that 30,000 foot view and not get tunneled down into rabbit holes. Something from the Matrix film itself, the idea of follow the rabbit, follow the white rabbit, and the idea of going down rabbit holes. Yes, sometimes we do need to delve deeply down a rabbit hole, but it's vitally important to remember to come back out of the rabbit hole and to, climb back up to 30,000 feet to check the big picture and to integrate the small dots that we've got from each rabbit hole into the bigger picture. So I hope this helps explain some of those things. As always, I do urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads there about how to find truth, certainty, techniques of thinking. I think these are the most important things, more important than particular episodes looking into individual truths, frankly. One thing that Nathaniel Branden said that sticks in my mind is that one error made on one's own judgment is better than 10 truths accepted on faith from somebody else. It's the method that really is going to be the saviour. We're a volitional consciousness, and we have to choose to exercise our rational faculty, and that's what's going to enable you, me and everyone, or anyone who chooses to discern truth. So do visit the website. There's stacks on there. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix. Change